Today's Nonsense Wars production features another older train thing, my Canadian National X-10a of 2016. Built in the 1910s, these 464 tank engines hauled commuter trains around Montreal into the 1950s. This 1:48 model actually won the Scale Models Best Machine Award at Bricks by the Bay 2018, and I still consider it one of my best models aesthetically, though it did not fare as well mechanically due to a perhaps sketchy experimental drivetrain. I built this locomotive not long after my QJ, and as such I built it in much the same way, studs up except for the studs out sides of the boiler. This construction actually extends all the way to the bunker and provides much of the model's structural integrity. As in my Model 40, only gravity and friction secure the cab, so you can easily remove it to access the battery box. A PF receiver can hide in the bunker, and the boiler has space for a variety of different motors. I've tried PFE, PFM, and now powered up M motors. The chassis does not have an easily describable wheel arrangement. The first axle pivots from just behind the third axle, and the second axle slides on the pivoting section. The third axle pivots off the front of a bogie containing the fourth and fifth axles. The sixth and seventh axles make up another bogie connected to the body, which in turn pivots above the third axle. I did this to improve rolling resistance and to minimize overhangs, but also to accommodate the experimental drivetrain. In the QJ, I discovered that I could get plenty of traction with just one tired axle if I concentrated the weight over that axle. In the X10, I wanted to see if I could get away with one driven axle if I distributed the weight properly. Unfortunately, I had to put the battery box in the cab, and I could only make one motor work in the boiler, so the driven axle doesn't carry enough weight, and the pulling performance suffers. That being said, if you add some extra weight and run on hard ground, the engine will pull 2, maybe 3 heavy cars, and I consider this satisfactory. On the flip side, in the worst case scenario, no extra weight and soft ground, it will struggle to do even this. Furthermore, this chassis configuration, specifically the independent articulation of the third axle and cylinders, has an aesthetic drawback as well. I can only put a connecting rod between the fourth and fifth axles, and I need to use a loosely coupled flex cable for the driving rod. I also need old parts and suspect connections to make this work. More reason I probably would not do it again. I mentioned that the boiler fits a variety of motors, but the X10 can also easily unpower itself for use with an external power car, as Baylug still runs mostly 9-volt trains at shows. In fact, the locomotive has many more hours running with external power than with PF. The single-driven axle easily detaches from the underside of the chassis, allowing for the removal of the tires and the gearing. The heavy articulation should already give it pretty low rolling resistance at this point, but I usually replace the electronics with lighter blanks as well. Now I have to talk about powered up because I haven't used it in a train or any custom application before. I wanted a PU engine for a future tractive effort testing project, and the X10 seemed like a good conversion candidate, especially as I also wanted to revisit and document it at some point. I had no trouble installing the hardware since it has less volume than the equivalent PF setup, but I did have trouble figuring out how to properly control said hardware using the Powered Up app. When I did this, if you didn't use a motor already used in an official train application, you couldn't have a pre-made controller with persistent proportional control. The slider elements in the custom controller parts bin all bounce back to zero if you let go, making them impractical for continuously running trains. LEGO seems to have fixed the sliders literally days after I shot footage for this video, but you still need to implement some trivial quote-unquote code to make everything work. Finally, a quick note on gear ratios. I couldn't decide if I wanted to use 1:1 or 3:5 off of the Powered Up M motor, so I tested them both and found the performance delta pretty marginal. 1:1 does allow for a faster top speed if the engine runs light, but pulling any significant load reduces it considerably. On the other hand, 3:5 theoretically allows for a heavier maximum load, but in practice, the low weight of the engine limits the effective torque of both configurations, so it's mostly a wash. On that note, this is the end of the video. Subscribe for that future tractive effort testing thing, and have a nice day.